My name is Wayne Lang, and I'm the chair of the NLC. Tonight, we will meet Hugh Segal and hear why a lifelong conservative believes Canadians should have a guaranteed basic income. This is NLC's second virtual Zoom presentation, and we're planning a third next month called Watching China, when we will revisit what is going on inside China and what is happening with China's relationships with Canada and the United States in this rapidly changing time. It will be held on November 19th, so after the US has gone to the polls. Normally we would be assembled for a live 6-week speaker series in the fall, as we've done for the past 15 years. But until COVID subsides and we're able to meet in person again, we will continue to bring you interesting topics in this virtual way. To learn more about our organization and the topics we have presented in the past, ranging from modern China, artificial intelligence, to what was a very interesting and humorous and thoughtful series on Newfoundland, go to connectnlc.ca. That's connectnlc.ca. Once again, we're very fortunate to have Karen Wells leading the conversation with Hugh Segal tonight. Karen is a former award-winning CBC documentarian, a lawyer, and an author with a recently published book. In fact, a very fascinating book about a little-known piece of Canadian history. And now I'd like to introduce you to Karen Wells.
Hello, Wayne. Thank you very much. And hello to everybody out there in Zoom land, as it were. I think there's over 200 of you registered for this event tonight. We had 200 for our first Zoom event back in June. That one was about animal epidemiology and pandemics. And now tonight, the Honourable Hugh Segal and guaranteed annual income. I know we have people tonight joining us in Squamish, in Victoria. We've got people in Atlantic Canada, in Fredericton, and in St. John's. So we can say Northumberland Learning Connection has gone coast to coast. Very proud of that. And of course, hello to all of those people who are our traditional audience here in Northumberland. Welcome, and fingers crossed that our internet connections all hold up. This is how the evening is going to work. We're going to have a conversation with Hugh Segal that will take us through till 8:10, 8:15, at which point we will start answering questions that you have submitted. So what I would ask is please make those questions succinct and send them in on the Q&A function. There's a little button at the bottom of the screen. And we will answer as many questions as we can, and what we can't answer tonight, we will post on the website in the days to come with the answers. Here we go. Tonight we're talking about guaranteed annual income, basic income. The concept has been around for a long time, and it remains contentious. Canada has tried it in a small way at least twice, but it has never, as it were, stuck. Our guest, the Honourable Hugh Segal, has been advocating for guaranteed annual income at both the federal and provincial levels, literally, for decades. That advocacy has raised eyebrows because he is a lifelong progressive conservative. His latest book, published just last year, is, what is it? Here it is. Bootstraps Need Boots, One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada. It's part memoir, part continuation of that advocacy. Mr. Segal is a Quebecer by birth. He grew up to be one of the most respected political strategists in the country. He has been Associate Cabinet Secretary for Provincial Federal Affairs under Ontario Premier Bill Davis, Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, where he sat for 10 years, before becoming Principal of Massey College at the University of Toronto. He is currently the Matthews Fellow in Global Studies at Queen's University. 4 years ago, Hugh Segal authored a discussion paper for Ontario Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne, and that was called Finding a Better Way, a Basic Income Pilot Project for Ontario. and we will be talking more about that later on. Hugh Segal is a man we're used to seeing in his trademark blue suit, well-tailored suit. However, he began life as a working-class kid from a poor Jewish family in Montreal. His father was a cab driver. His mother worked at an all-night drugstore. As with all of us, that childhood has gone a long way to shaping his life and the things he believes in and advocates for. I'm very happy to welcome the Honourable Hugh Segal to the Northumberland Learning Connection. Welcome, Hugh. There you are. Hello.
Hi there. Hi, Karen. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Can we start with most recent events first? As we moved up to the throne speech 1 week ago, there was a great deal of speculation that we may well be seeing a basic annual income introduced, that this was the time. It didn't happen. Why do you think?
Well, I think the government was focused on the intense issues around COVID and the second wave, understandably. And I think to their credit, they did make some changes in the EI program, which would be helpful to part-time workers, gig workers who are not normally covered by EI. So that's not unconstructive, but they did not do anything for the 3.5 million Canadians, both the welfare poor and the working poor, who live beneath the poverty line in Canada from coast to coast. So that issue remains unaddressed, but you have to be an optimist in this sort of process. They have yet to do their budget. They have yet to figure out what the medium-term plan is. They're sort of focusing on a short-term plan. I think they will understand that trying to fix poverty by addressing EI is kind of like dealing with the fire in the basement by putting a new coat of paint on the roof. It may be okay for a while, but it's not going to solve your problem. So I remain optimistic that between various motions in the House of Commons and motions in the Senate, that the matter yet may be addressed.
Did you think that it might happen this time?
I probably was never of the view that it would be in the throne speech. I mean,
Right.
I think that enough of those, and as have you as a working journalist, throne speech tends to be the menu. The budget tends to be the recipe. How are we going to do this and how are we going to pay for it? And remember, in a minority parliament, the government doesn't have total control of the agenda. If I think back to the first Trudeau minority between 1972 and 1974, a whole bunch of things like Petro-Canada and other stuff happened because David Lewis and the NDP said, these are our terms for support. And I've even noticed, surprisingly, one or two Conservative MPs expressing their concern about how welfare works so badly in the provinces, inefficiently, not lifting anybody above half the poverty line, and discouraging work, which if you're a Conservative, you're opposed to. You think people should be encouraged to work. I'm not at all convinced that that process will not produce some positive progress before this Parliament is done.
Because there is, that tradition of progressive social policies in minority governments. It goes back further than Pierre Trudeau's. It goes right back to Pearson era as well, did it not?
Absolutely. One of Mike Pearson's great, and I say this despite the fact that I've never voted Liberal federally in my life, but one of his great achievements was that in a minority government between 1963 and 1968, all he did was take Tommy Douglas's Medicare program from Saskatchewan and facilitate its implementation right across Canada in every province through federal provincial backup and support. He brought in support for post-secondary education. He did some really substantial things in minority parliament, and that's where I've always been of the view that minority parliaments are actually quite compelling in terms of the country's agenda going forward. Great opportunity.
Not a bad thing at all.
No, ma'am.
No. All right, can we get to definitions? Because there's a lot of different descriptors around this one. Basic income, guaranteed annual income. Is there any difference?
Well, there is. When you think about Andrew Yang, who was the very articulate candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, he called for a universal basic income, but what he really meant was every American from the wealthiest to the most poor would get a check for $1,000 a month, which he called the freedom dividend. And his assumption was that people at the low end of the income scale would keep most of it because they don't pay a lot of tax. And those who are higher up in the scale would have a lot of it taxed back, and therefore it would work. That is not the Canadian tradition. The Canadian tradition, whether it's the guaranteed income supplement for seniors above the age of 65 or similar programs, is you have to first demonstrate, probably through a normal tax filing, what your level of income is. And if you fall beneath a certain line, you're topped up. That's how the GIS program works now for our seniors. So first of all, the Andrew Yang proposal is wildly too expensive at the beginning. And you know, folks who are doing a little bit better will get solid tax advice so as to maximize their ability not to pay too much tax. So I'm not sure you get as much back as he thought might be workable. But the basic income, which is basically to say, look, no one in Canada should live beneath the poverty line, and no one in Canada should be dependent upon a provincial welfare system that has within it very strict clawback rules that massively discourage work. If you're a single woman living in Toronto, you get about $640 a month if you're a welfare recipient, which is about 45% of the poverty line in that city. And then if you try to earn a couple of $100 a month more because you're trying to make circumstances better for your family or have a little bit more freedom financially, that will get clawed back dollar for dollar by the provincial government. So we have these welfare programs, well-intentioned, but because they're based on the notion that the only thing that is appropriate in life is work, there's no other way you can live your life other than to work, those people who can't work or who aren't working for a myriad of reasons are discouraged from working. And as a conservative, I'm of the view that you should never discourage people who can work from working. And welfare now does that in every one of our provinces. And that's why it's so destructive. And that's why a federal basic income tied to your level of need, a top up, but which encouraged work would be a step, in my view, in the right direction.
And the goal is, for you, the goal is to eradicate poverty or to bring it down a great deal.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, here's the reality, Karen. I live in Kingston, which is a little bit deeper in Eastern Ontario than Northumberland. We have about 7 prisons within 50 miles of the downtown. 80% of the guests of Her Majesty in those prisons are from the 10% of the population who live beneath the poverty line. Mm-hmm. If you wander into any large city emergency ward in a hospital, there will be the odd person who is wheeled in after a trauma or a car accident or a heart attack or something that is truly urgent. But then there'll be a whole bunch of people sitting in that emergency ward because they have nowhere else to go and they're having something act up from one of their chronic conditions. And the vast majority of those people will be either the working poor or the welfare poor. So we know that poverty is a perfect predictor of bad health outcomes, a perfect predictor of a shorter life, a perfect predictor of bad outcomes for the kids at school. And all of that, of course, has huge implications on what all of us as taxpayers have to finance on an annual basis. So I think the way to reduce some of those other costs, increase productivity, increase the amount of participation in the workforce, is to have a program that begins to reduce the pathologies of poverty, which are very, very costly in our society.
How did you, or what took you to the thought that government could have a really constructive role in reducing poverty, that was a place for government to act? Where'd that come from?
Well, I mean, if you grow up in a poor working class family, and working class would have been an overstatement of our financial circumstance, And if you see what that produces, I mean, I remember the local congregation sending us a box of food when they knew we were in some difficulty. I understood what that felt like in our family. And when you had the privilege, as I did, of working as Bill Davis's first legislative assistant at Queen's Park during another minority government, when the NDP and the Liberals brought a motion in committee to reduce the salary of the Minister of Social Services, who was Margaret Birch, and her deputy, who was the late Doug Wright, very distinguished public servant, went on to be president of the University of Waterloo, to $1 because they were not addressing seniors' poverty. We had just been through an election, 75. Poverty of seniors did not come up as an issue. And so when that motion passed, the deputy came to see me, Doug came to see me and said, well, you know, what are we going to do about it? I said, well, Doug, it's not law unless it's passed by the legislature. So, don't, cool your jets. But maybe we should find out what they're talking about because it hasn't come up on our agenda in any way. And so a study was done by the Ministry of what was then called Treasury, Economics and Intergovernmental Affairs. Darcy McHugh was the minister, a very small C conservative minister from Chatham, Ontario. And it actually did reveal that 35% of the senior citizens in Ontario, who were largely women, by the way, because in those days, men didn't live as long as they live now, were actually living in poverty, which meant that they didn't have enough money for rent, food, heat, and clothing, and public transit in any one month. And the notion, the Toronto Star reported on this, of those folks going and buying little cans of dog food and cat food to add a little bit of protein to their diet was not apocryphal, it was the truth. So when that became the report that was circulated to cabinet, I was a junior person with my back against the wall watching the debate, and I thought, well, this is going to be one of those classic left-right battles with all the, the folks are saying you can't pay people not to work and all of that good stuff. But when it came up, it was Darcy McHugh himself, to his everlasting credit, very conservative finance minister, who said, look, these are the women who were there when the boys were at war. They kept the home fires burning. They're the ones who were there who got us through the Depression. They're not going to live in poverty in my Ontario, period, full stop. And then with the support of the NDP and the Liberals, we brought in it was then called the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement Gains, GAINS. And that was the premise of the automatic top-up. And then I saw that over 3 years, that poverty rate of 35% was reduced to under 5%. So that program spread to other parts of Canada. Then it was federalized by the government of Canada as the Guaranteed Income Supplement. So that was a clear example to me that A, this is not rocket science. B, we know how to do it effectively and efficiently. And the good thing about it was it didn't involve hiring any more caseworkers in the social services ministries. It just involved people making an honest tax return, which the law says we're all supposed to do, and then having that cutoff number trigger an automatic top-up. So that's when I realized that we were doing a whole bunch of things in terms of poverty that may have been well-intentioned, may have come from the 19th century, was costing a lot of money, but was not very effective and was in fact producing some contrary results. And as we sit here this evening, our provinces spend $30 billion a year financing welfare programs in their jurisdictions. $30 billion. And frankly, it doesn't do anything to reduce the amount of poverty or keep people out of poverty. The federal government's child benefit program, and these are credit for this, and the GIS do a much better job of achieving that goal. And it's in our interest to do that, not just for people over 65, but for people between the ages of 18 and 64 who find themselves in poverty. And it's who it is in our interest to bring back into the economic mainstream.
You painted a very positive picture of this sort of approach. There's no question there is opposition. I mean, that's why it's not here. On many different levels. First, there's moral opposition, if you like, the notion that it will discourage work and that poor people are lazy. How do you turn that one around? I mean, I know we have the working poor, but how do you address that?
Well, Karen, I would say two things. I believe in evidence-based decisions. That's the best way to protect the taxpayer and to achieve good public policy. There is just no evidence from the pilot project that was done for 3 years in Manitoba, from the
I
pilot,
want to get to that in a minute. Yeah.
or the one that was recently completed in Finland, or the ones now going on in the Netherlands, that having that basic income backstop actually reduces the size of the labor force or people participating in the labor force. In fact, the evidence is quite contrary to that. Now, I can understand people saying, look, you know, there's this shibboleth of the welfare queen sitting on the couch, eating bonbons and watching television. Well, here's the truth. Truth of the matter is that what poverty does to those people who are living in poverty, the first thing it steals, aside from their dignity and their self-respect, is time. They're rushing about trying to figure out how to get enough food in the lunchbox for their kid to go to school. They're rushing about trying to figure out, get enough money to pay the rent. They're in a scramble all the time. And anybody who thinks it's about sitting on the couch with bonbons and watching television hasn't really spent much time with people living in poverty, as I did when I was working on that pilot project for the Premier of Ontario. So there's no evidence to back up that bias, if I may say so. Secondly, you know, we give a lot of money to people who don't work now, and it's financed by our tax system. There are depreciation allowances for people who have a lot of capital, who have a lot of property. I'm not against any of that, but then we have crop insurance that's co-financed by taxpayers. A whole bunch of things we do for other aspects of society because it contributes to economic liquidity and stability. And we don't ask about whether we can afford all that. But when it comes to providing some measure of stability and liquidity for poor people, all of a sudden we have a huge debate about whether we can afford it or is it moral. And I don't think that passes the smell test, quite frankly.
The other major opposition is that it will simply cost too much. Now, I think Pierre Poilievre requested a costing of this from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. What did it come in at? I don't know, $700 billion or some such thing. You take issue with those numbers.
Yeah, so let me be clear. When Pierre Poilievre, who was the finance critic for his party, made that request about a year and a half ago now of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the Parliamentary Budget Officer said, look, the actual gross cost would be about $70 billion a year, not counting the federal programs now in place that would be replaced by that. Secondly, what none of that counted, because the Parliamentary Budget Officer was just looking at federal implications, was that if you brought people into a basic income federal program, they would all become ineligible for welfare. And that welfare ineligibility would mean the provinces would have $30 billion to put into healthcare, put into long-term care. It would be a very good way to deal with the province's need for liquidity, and it would establish, just as universal health insurance does, that some things are kind of a basic right in our country, and living beneath the poverty line is not acceptable in that context, especially in a country as wealthy as we are. And the other thing which is really important is that if you had a basic income that encouraged work, by not clawing back dollar for dollar as provincial welfare does, then of course those people would start to pay tax. And in the pilot that was organized for Ontario, when you began to earn, and there, by the way, the notion was that everybody would be topped up to something like $1,300 a month. If you got to the point where you earned another $1,300, then you would be paying the same level of tax that the rest of us pay on our earned income now, rather than what happens under the welfare system, where you're being taxed dollar for what you earn, which is 100% on earned income, and the wealthiest Canadians do not pay 100% on earned income. So the notion that it's unaffordable, I think, is one of those right-wing shibboleths that just doesn't stand the test of any kind of analysis.
Now, I mean, much of what you're saying rests on the idea of redirecting spending for social programs in the latter part of your remarks. Isn't that part of why the left often objects to guaranteed annual income? Because the concern there is that you are eroding the social safety net and it leads to privatization.
So
It's a major concern.
Karen, that is a major concern raised by the left, usually by the folks who are associated with foundations and organizations that are funded by our public sector unions. And so the first concern is we do have, in my view, very hardworking, very publicly committed caseworkers all across Canada working in provincial welfare programs. And the worry is if you have an automatic cash transfer from Ottawa, they would all lose their jobs. I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of those people were people who came out of social science degrees, undergraduate degrees. They went to government to help people, not to be cops, not to be auditors, not to be making judgments about people's lifestyle and how they live, but to actually help them. And a lot of those people could be repurposed to actually help people navigate the system and get those with special needs to get the kind of special support which they need. Those of us in Canada who've been on the side of the basic income have been very clear. We just want to change the way in which cash is now transferred to low-income people. We don't want to limit disability programs. We don't want to limit special programs for people with special needs, people, for example, with the autism spectrum. That's not our purpose at all. Our purpose is just to make the way in which we get cash to people who are living beneath the poverty line more efficient, more effective, more humane, less stigmatizing, and more encouraging of work. Now, I think part of the opposition on the left comes from a little bit of an anxiety that, well, if Milton Friedman was in favor of this idea,
who was a very big free market economist,
right,
yes.
Yeah, you know, and the Chicago School of Economics,
Yep.
and all that. So it can't be a good thing. Progressive socialists across the country can't support anything Milton Friedman supported. Now, to be fair, Milton Friedman made the following case. He said, look, if you made the American government responsible for the Sahara Desert, there would be a sand shortage in 3 years. And the case he was making was that there is something intrinsic to bureaucracy in the way in which programs are administered, or having the swells in government tell low-income people how they have to live their lives, that intrinsically doesn't work. Low-income people can be trusted to do the right thing with the money, just like anybody else can be trusted to do the right thing with the money. I think that our challenge here is to make it perfectly clear that he was in favor of the Big Bang. One check, just as you mentioned earlier, Karen, and shut down a whole bunch of other special programs. That's not the Canadian proposal. The Canadian proposal is simply to deal with the cash transfer side, but those other special programs in place should be sustained and continued because they're necessary. This would not, in my view, be problematic, but you know, the hard left has a problem with it, and I've never been hard right or hard left. I kind of come from that centrist, progressive conservative tradition, so I'm not particularly troubled by their views, and hopefully a Liberal government supported by an NDP party will not be troubled by their views either.
I take your point about, as it were, what's being called the poverty industry and the concern from public sector unions in that regard. There is a basic, I won't say ideological opposition there, but a serious concern about putting all the management of money into the hands of individuals who perhaps might not be, through no fault of their own, good at managing those funds. You know, what happens if you run through to the end of the month and for whatever reason, just plain bad luck, your money's run out? What happens to those folks if there's no more welfare?
Well, let me say that I'll just argue, if I may, that the worst kind of discrimination is the discrimination of low expectations. And the notion that low-income people do not know how to manage money and do not know how to spend it properly is a pretty bigoted view. When I was in a debate for C.D. Howe on this issue many months ago. Conrad Black and Janice Thompson from Saskatchewan were against, and Paul Begala, who used to work for President Clinton, and I were in favor. And when someone made the same comment about, well, low-income people, they won't work, they'll misspend the money, Paul said, well, he said, he knows a lot of trust fund kids in New York who've never worked a day in their life. All they do is clip coupons, and they're pretty busy. They're traveling, they're on cruises, they're going to the gym, they're buying new homes. So the notion that frittering away your time and or not necessarily spending wisely is an issue just for low-income people, I think is pretty bigoted. And look, the other thing I would say is let's remember who those 3.5 million people are. The percentage of those people who are either Black or Indigenous or people of color, working poor or welfare poor, is actually very high. It's the largest percentages amongst the group who fall into that category. And what we have learned during the tragic long-term care death cycle during the COVID is that a lot of the low-income working poor who were not earning enough in any one place with benefits or sick leave to get by had to work in several of those facilities. And by going from facility to facility, they actually became innocent vectors of the virus. So there are costs to pay when people are not treated with a fair measure of dignity. And I think we can afford to do it in Canada. And I think we should show the courage to try.
Let me pause for a moment and remind our audience that we will be going to questions. So please get those questions in 1 or 2 sentences, please, not paragraphs, and send them in on the Q&A function, and we will get to those in a few minutes. Hugh, can we go and look a little bit at some of the pilot projects that have been launched in this country? The one that for a long time people forgot about was the project in the 70s in Dauphin, Manitoba. And that, I believe, lasted for 3 years out of the scheduled 5. The result, I think you alluded to this earlier, the hospitalization went down, indices of all sorts of negative social conditions improved. And what happened to the work rate? Did it encourage people to stop working?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's an important question. During the 3 years that the pilot ran, there was no reduction in participation in the workforce, except for 2 very small groups. People referred to by StatsCan as unattached young males, which was high school students. They could continue high school and finish high school because whatever the financial difficulties were that their family faced didn't force the family to get them out of high school and send them to work. They could finish high school because of the top-up that came from the MinCon project. And the other group, this was before, by the way, meaningful mat leave, were mothers of new children who could stay home a little longer if they wanted to. And we know now that if you can stay home and if you choose to stay home, the impact for the new infant and for a whole bunch of other positive indicators is pretty substantial. If you just think about, we're dealing now 1975. So you think about what those people in 1975 who got to finish high school, what that meant back then in terms of your job potential and your earning potential, and how much they would have paid in taxes over their working life over those who would have had to leave high school to work in menial labor. We probably ended up being very much a net benefit from the way that project operated. The other thing I would say in terms of something more recent, the Department of Economics at McMaster did an analysis of the basic income pilot in Ontario. It was supposed to run for 3 years. It only ran for 1. But they did an analysis of the recipients in the Hamilton area and what had happened in terms of their workplace participation, in terms of their health, in terms of their education, in terms of their involvement in the community, and all the indices were precisely the same as Dauphin. And moreover, what some people did, frankly, was they used the extra money to take courses at college so they could improve their prospects for better jobs in the future.
Which today is comparable to finishing high school in 1975.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I would argue that now what's really interesting is to think about why the pilot in Dauphin started. So, Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister. Ed Schreier was the Premier of Manitoba. And in the early 70s, the federal government realized that this notion that was brought in by Mr. Pearson, so as to make sure that health insurance spread across the country, that every dollar spent on hospitals and hospitalization would be backed up dollar for dollar by the feds, was no longer affordable. So they went to a grant system where, based on the size of your population, every province got a statutory grant every year, part of the Federal Provincial Fiscal Relations Act agreement, and then the provinces could spend that how they wanted in areas broadly related to healthcare. And that's when everybody realized that one of the great generators of healthcare cost was poverty. So it was decided between those two governments, why don't we try to see in a particular community, if we brought in something which alleviated poverty, whether that would in fact begin to diminish the uptick in healthcare costs, which would be unsustainable. And that's when we found out that it did reduce healthcare costs, the Manitoba Health Insurance Program, by 8.5%. And if you take that right across Canada, that's a very substantial amount of money. And it did it without in any way reducing participation in the workforce. So that's the context that generated that pilot. And I think as we sit here tonight and reflect on the context we're now living in, demographic pressures, however careful people are and however much they exercise and eat properly and all the rest, there is a certain point in the cycle, whether in one's 9th generation or 8th generation, where one will need acute hospital care of some sort. If we continue to generate the need for hospital care because we haven't addressed poverty and the poverty pathologies, we're going to find even more congestion in the system we're all depending upon. So there's a strong case to be made that investing in the reduction of poverty is one of the best ways to sustain the capacity of our healthcare system to keep on doing the excellent job it does under sometimes trying conditions.
Okay, you spoke about why it started. I mean, why in the case of Dauphin and in the case of the Liberal experiment, which you authored essentially, why did they stop? Why doesn't it carry on?
Well, they stopped for different reasons. But in all cases, a change of government was part of the formula that stopped it.
Yeah.
In the case of Manitoba, Ed Schreier was replaced by Sterling Lyon, and Pierre Trudeau was replaced by Joe Clark. And at that point in the cycle, often new governments don't embrace the ideas started by older governments, by those who've been defeated. So that was part of it. And there was also, of course, the fact that Pierre Trudeau, before he was defeated, had gone to a G7 economics conference and accepted the need for austerity generally across the broad economic world. And when those austerity things were brought in, that, of course, reduced the ability to finance projects that are going to go on for a long time at some cost. In Ontario, it's a more complex situation in Ontario because part of what I did when I was asked by the Premier to work on this proposal was I met with the leaders of the other parties. I met with the leader of the NDP, Andrea Horwath, and I met with Patrick Brown, who was then the leader of Progressive Conservatives. And while they were cynical about the government and its purposes and goals, which is what happens in opposition, and that's what we pay them to do, in fact, to not be necessarily always accepting of government motivation, they said, look, let's see how the pilot goes. Let's see what the numbers tell us. Let's see if it's good public policy. And then we'll reserve the right to be supportive or to be in opposition. The same question was put to the Ford campaign bus prior to the election. And the answer was very explicit. Toronto Star, Laurie Moss-Bratton asked the question. And the answer was, we're interested in the pilot. We want to see its results before we make any decisions. Then the Ford government got elected. And you may recall they had a series of promises, freezing the rates of hydro, reducing the level of gas tax, a buck of beers, a whole bunch of things. And of course, you go through the what I would call the theatrical proposition of having an audit of what you've been left with by the previous government, and then you always say, "Oh my God, oh God, I mean the closet is bare," and therefore every ministry was asked to put some money on the table from its operations to help the government get through that process in the first few days, and the Ministry of Family Social Services was glad to offer up the next 2 years of the pilot because it was going to cost about $50 million a year, which was the agreed to number. And that's, I think, how it died. So I don't think it was an actually ideological decision. I think it was just about coming up with some cash. And of course, when you have to do that, you don't want to admit that a buck of beer and freezing hydro rates and lowering the taxes on gasoline is why you have to shut down this program to figure out a better way to help poor people. So then you say, well, you know, the best social policy is a job, and you get into all that rhetorical nonsense, which isn't very helpful, but that's how it happened. That's
not an ideological decision, perhaps, but definitely a political decision.
Yes, that's
yeah.
Very fair.
You referred to it as the canary in the coal mine, the cutting off the basic income pilot projects in Ontario. Yeah.
I did, and let me say this. I mean, I will question people's judgment. That's part of politics and debate in a free society. But I don't question people's character. I don't think that Premier Ford was looking for a way to be more insensitive and heartless with respect to low-income people. And I'm kind of hoping that what we've all been through as a society and are going to go through probably for some time on COVID may get some people thinking about whether, you know, we can afford to have one part of our population. If you look at all the maps of where the COVID virus has been the most serious in terms of infections and in terms of serious illness, they are not in the better parts of the city.
Low-income areas.
Wealthier communities, all in the low-income parts of the bigger cities across Canada. And, you know, do we really want to maintain that kind of vulnerability unrepentantly? If we can do something responsibly to reduce it and make sure that everybody has a fair shot. And I've never been, I mean, I don't believe in equality of outcomes. That's a kind of socialist thing, and I give them credit. I just don't believe in it. But I do believe in equality of opportunity. And I think that's pretty fundamental for how our society operates. And I think a basic income, just like other programs we have brought in, the child benefit, universal health insurance, free primary and secondary education, support for crop insurance, a whole bunch of things we do are really
those. Can I stop you there, because we do have questions that have come in, and I just want to read a couple of things and see where we're at. We have a question here from Judy Smith. I believe Judy Smith is in Coburg. She's saying, I agree with what you're talking about, but is $1,300 a month, which I think is the number that's been bandied about, is that sufficient? I mean, are you still asking people to live on not enough?
So there's going to be a debate on an ongoing basis about what the number should be. The federal government set aside the low-income cutoff, which was basically saying if your income was less than half the median income in your province, you were living beneath the poverty line, and brought in a new measure, which is called the market basket measure, which says what does it actually cost to buy food and clothing and heat and rent, etc., in your part of the country. So the good news is that when government would develop this plan, they'd have to set what that number is, and it would be a different number in some parts of the country based on the cost structure there, let's say downtown Vancouver, versus what it might be in rural New Brunswick. And so the government has the ability to deal with that. We deal with it now through the CRA. We deal with it now through EI. So the number will adjust, and it may very well be a number that is higher. But that's the sort of thing that you want government to work on and to design in a way that is sustainable, affordable, and reflective of getting people out of the deepest recesses of poverty and able to actually have a fighting shot.
Okay, and we did have a question from somebody asking what happens to regional disparities, and I think that's basically what you've answered, is that the amount varies from place to place. Right. somebody is asking what happens with the effect of the Indian Act, and how does all of that play in to First Nations peoples?
So let me just say that for the pilot that was run in Ontario, both in Hamilton and in Thunder Bay and in Lindsay near Peterborough, the decision was taken that First Nations people who are living in those communities would be eligible to be participants in the pilot like anybody else. But it was also decided that because we have some First Nations reservation communities that are in fact quite burdened with poverty, in that case, the province would work with the chiefs of Ontario to figure out how to do a test in those communities in a way that will respect the sovereignty of our First Nations, the spirit of reconciliation, but make sure they had a chance to participate. And in fact, if you look at the report from the Commission on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, one of their very strong recommendations was that there be a basic income. And that was also one of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was chaired by Senator Sinclair. So First Nations are open to the idea, but you'd have to do it in a way in their own communities, run by their own band councils, now regulated by the Indian Act, which is a whole other issue,
Right.
in a way that was respectful of their rights to self-government.
And consultative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. We're back to the questions about money. There's an anonymous question in here about debt and deficit. I mean, what about the amount of money this adds to the national debt? Can we handle this?
Well, the answer is if we take a look at a normal kind of revenue flow to the federal government, so what it would likely come back to in the days after COVID, if we ever get to those, you're looking at a number that if you look at all the various sources, both on the federal balance sheet and off, that is something in the area of 350 to $400 billion a year, all in, all the pieces. The notion that we would be investing after you reduce cost for the 30 billion that's being saved by provincial jurisdictions, roughly about 10% of that number to eradicate poverty, to eradicate the pathologies of poverty, that would strike me as a pretty high quality investment with a very measurable return on investment. Now, we are now running at a deficit which is historically high. It's not the highest deficit we've had as a percentage of GDP. We had a higher deficit after the war. And one of the things that we found after the war, and one of the things that we found when we began to rebuild after the Great Depression, is that if you fail to put liquidity into the population, if you go to austerity, which there are some people who are now calling for, that's how you make a recession worse. That's how you make a depression worse and longer. If you put liquidity into the marketplace, which in this case would encourage work, which would itself generate taxation, my view is that over a period of time, this would become quite affordable. And that's without even counting the savings to things like the penal system and the healthcare system that would emerge as the pathologies of poverty diminish. So my view is it is affordable. And, you know, the federal government has the right to decide, would they phase it all in at the beginning? Would they begin at a certain level and ramp it up as the economy could afford it? There's a whole bunch of options they have, and I wouldn't deny them those options. But the notion that we say, well, because we have this high instant deficit, which contributes to the debt because of the COVID expenditures, we should just say, well, I guess poor people missed this boat. See you in 10 years, strikes me as the most fiscally irresponsible thing we could do.
There is, I mean, there's prevalence now of new monetary theory that suggests we should not be as deeply concerned about deficit and debt as perhaps we have been in the past 10, 20 years. But there is a limit. There's a point at which you have to say, we're spending too much. I mean, do you see a limit there?
Of course. And the limit is defined not necessarily by the size of the debt, but the limit is defined by our ability to service the debt and begin to pay it down in a rational way, which I notice The Conservatives have suggested they would want to have a 10-year plan. There's nothing inconsistent with a 10-year plan to reduce the debt and a 10-year program to reduce the amount of people living in poverty. In fact, I think they're quite complementary. If you look now, I saw one large financial institution just did $1 billion loan and they paid less than 2%. And the federal government at some levels is paying even less than that. The cost of money these days is as low as it's ever been.
And it's probably ever going to be.
It's probably ever going to be, no question. But that doesn't mean that this cannot be done responsibly in a fashion that concurs with our overall duty to be fiscally responsible over the medium and long term.
Questions here around that McMaster study, and I think it also pertains to a study that was done in Finland, both studies indicated that a great number of people continued to work and it didn't de-incentivize people, if that's a word. But there are still 20 or 30% of the people in those studies who discontinued work, or, it ain't perfect.
Yeah, so it wasn't the case in Manitoba. In Dauphin, there were numbers nowhere close to that. There was a very tiny percentage of new mothers and younger members of the workforce who could finish school. In Finland, let's be clear, the Finnish pilot only focused on the unemployed. So it wasn't aimed at all those people who are living beneath the poverty line. It focused on all those people who didn't have jobs to begin with. So you would have had a different result when that is your actual target project. So I don't know that that is relevant, other than to say that it didn't increase the amount of people who didn't want to find jobs. And what they measured in Finland was the people who were looking for work or who used the opportunity to get more education to find better jobs. But they all began as unemployed because that's the way they defined their pilot project. In fact, we had the Finnish ambassador and one of the senior academics working on the project make a presentation on its design at the Monk School when I was working across the street at Massey College, and they're very clear about how they designed it.
No, thank you for clarifying that. I didn't realize that it was only the unemployed. Yeah. Somebody is asking here, Robin Ivory, why a basic income would not lead to inflation. If you're putting more money in people's pockets, doesn't everybody just raise the price of everything?
Well, that's a very good question. And because it relates to the fact, let's assume that you are a landlord and you know that the people who are living in your building, some of whom are low-income people, are now getting a top-up. Won't you want to raise the rent, kind of gobble that up for your own needs and purposes? Well, in every Canadian province, we have rent control. And there are very tight criteria by which you are allowed to raise the rent. And you cannot raise the rent because your tenants have a bit more income. You have to raise the rent because there's maintenance costs or other issues, and there are rent control tribunals. So, and rent is the largest cost, by the way, for people who are living beneath the poverty line. So I think we do have some balustrades in the system which would protect us from the worst kinds of outcomes which may be generated by a basic income top-up.
And presumably increasing income for people in poverty is not the kind of huge gesture that leads to inflation. I mean, it's modest.
Well, let's be clear. We're dealing with 10% of the population.
Yeah.
We're dealing with, these are not people who buy 3 new suits a year. These are not people who take long holidays. These are not people who set up tax-free accounts in other countries. These are people who spend the money on food and rent and clothing for their kids, and those are not, by definition, inflationary, particularly when you're only starting with 10% of the population to begin with.
There is, British Columbia is currently looking at basic income. I mean, they, of course, are now in the middle of an election. And as I recall, it was really the Greens that were insisting on basic income more than the NDP. But the man who is chairing that committee, David Green,
Yes.
seems to have come down squarely on the fence, which must be a very uncomfortable place to be. But even as deeply looking into this, he for one is still not clear which way to jump. Can you understand that?
Well, I think you're right about that. He was one of the speakers at the Queen's Institute for Social Policy just a couple of weeks ago, and it was clear that he was on the fence, as you describe it. Look, I went out to BC about 3 years ago, and I met with the Liberals, and I met with the New Democrats, and I made the case and talked to their spokespersons and critics, and the Green Party, to their credit, have been on the side of this for a very long time, and they had terms and conditions to support the NDP, who had the exact same amount of seats as the Liberals after the election, to help them form a government. And the way in which the government dealt with that commitment was to structure this inquiry with some very able and thoughtful people working on it. I don't want to prejudge where they're going to emerge. The notion that they be nuanced in their recommendation would not surprise me. But the notion that they would be completely opposed to a basic income in their recommendation would stun me, because frankly, the economists and others working on the commission are too bright to end up in that corner.
Would you see BC as perhaps being the most likely place where this might come to pass, where we might see basic income?
I would say there are two provinces. BC is one, and the other one would be Prince Edward Island. Before the last election in Prince Edward Island, the Liberal Premier and government had a motion passed unanimously in the legislature to have a basic income in Prince Edward Island. And then when the Tories won the election with Dennis King, a very thoughtful red Tory premier, had the same resolution put to the legislature, which was passed, and then structured a working legislative committee on design. And it's been working studiously. Witnesses from all over, including yours truly and some others, who went to give as much background as they could, and they are going to make a strong recommendation about how to proceed. And I think actually one of Ottawa's options would be to have all of Prince Edward Island be a test case for the country, because Prince Edward Island has about 165,000 Canadians. It's the fastest growing province in the Maritimes, and it is quite a diverse province in terms of a mix of urban and rural, and it's one of the densest provinces because there's people living almost everywhere along the island. So the notion that that would be a national test, only 22,000 islanders live beneath the poverty line, so it's a manageable number, and that would be a great opportunity for the country to make progress. And I don't think the vast majority of Canadians would be troubled about Prince Edward Island being the place where we do a national test. And in the same way as we now have people working on vaccines while we're ordering vaccines, the notion that while there's a test going on in one province, we brought in a national program across the country is not, in my view, unreasonable. And what BC does, I guess, will depend upon how the provincial election goes and who is successful in that process. If the NDP comes back
with a clear majority,
who knows what that will generate.
We are running close to the wire here. We do have one question that revolves around the question of jobs. Does basic income lead to job creation, basically?
Well, the answer, in my view, is yes, because if you think about it, if you have more liquidity in those parts of the community that are now living beneath the poverty line, and if that liquidity generates more money in the community by people who spend it for good reason, that will, by definition, generate jobs. And that will also give, by the way, some people who are now in low-paying, awful jobs, the chance to stop and look for a better job, quite frankly, where they get higher pay because maybe they've gotten a bit more education or used the money constructively. So overall, I think it would increase employment, and it would also increase the gross domestic product of the country, which is not in and of itself a bad thing.
and not erode the desire for a higher minimum wage?
I actually view the issues as very separate. When I've heard some representatives of small business attack the CERB because they said, well, you know, if they're getting $2,000 a month for not working, why would they come back and work in this
Or less?
less after tax? And frankly, here's my response. My response is, if your economic model is based on paying people not enough to live on, it's not a workable economic model, and it shouldn't be sustained. And, you know, I don't believe when you go into a restaurant, the waiter should be subsidizing how much we pay for a meal. I think we should be paying for the full cost of the meal, which includes a fair salary for the waiter.
That seems as good a place to end our evening as any. Thank you so much. It's very generous of you to give us this time this evening, and a couple of comments have already come in of appreciation. So thank you so much, Hugh Segal.
Thank you, Karen. Great privilege.
Thank you. And thank you as well, I should say, Hugh, for the book. The book, by the way, is, here it is, Bootstraps Need Boots, One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada. It's published by UBC Press, available through independent bookstores in Northumberland County. And if you're somewhere else, I'm sure you will find somewhere else to buy that book. Thank you to everyone. NLC's next Zoom event will be on November 19th. The focus will be on China, what is happening in the country, what about China's relationship with Canada, given things like the extradition of Meng Wanzhou, and given that this will be after the US election, what will the relationship be, or might it be, between those two superpowers? That's November the 19th. Our guest will be